Hi everyone, welcome back to Ukulele Next Steps with me, Matt Stead. I'm really excited about the next two videos. What we're going to do is we're going to take a classic 8 bars blues song called Trouble in Mind. We're going to break it down over 2 weeks. In the first week, we're going to look at the song format, which is fascinating in itself, the relationship between the first, fourth and fifth chords. Then we're going to look at extending those chords out to make them more interesting. So playing things like major sixths and dominant ninths instead of the usual chords. In the next video, which will come next week, I'm going to show you a picking pattern to allow you to pick your way through this song, and also introducing little kind of sus notes, which I think you'll find quite fascinating. And lastly, we're going to take a look at a couple of blues scales, which will allow you to improvise around this tune. So much to come. Let's dig right in. Because there's quite a lot to learn in these next two lessons, I've actually provided 5 worksheets for this, and they're all available. If you follow the link in the description, you can follow a link to my Dropbox where you can download these all completely for free and print them off. I'll put portions of them on the screen as well, just in case you don't have a printer at home. So Trouble in Mind is a song that was formally published in the 1920s by pianist Richard Jones. It's a blues song as we know it from his version, but actually it kind of predates that and goes back to spiritual songs from the late 1800s. So he took their lyrics and feel and then added a blues feel to it. Now, what I find absolutely fascinating, and part of the reason I've chosen this song, is that there have been many versions over the years. One of the most famous is Louis Armstrong. We've also got a Nina Simone version. Later on, we've even got a Johnny Cash version. And every version is slightly different. Johnny Cash's is more traditional country, so it uses the basic 1-4-5 chords. Nina Simone's is a lot more jazz, as you would expect, with some really interesting extended chords. So what we're going to do is we're going to take the very basic structure, which I'm going to teach you first, and then we're going to jazzify it, if you like. We're going to add more and more extended chords to give you loads of opportunities to create your own arrangements. Now, going away from the way I normally do these videos, I'm going to actually get you to play the thing right from the off. We're going to take the most basic version and we're just going to play through 2 verses or 2 of the strains, just to give you an idea of how it goes, the feel of it, and to get you used to the relationship between those 3 chords. In terms of strumming, I'm not too fussed how you do it. You can add some syncopation, but I'm just going to strum up and down. Just a really gentle swing strum. Remember, uke, 45-degree angle, strumming roughly where the body of the uke meets the neck. The chords you'll be familiar with. We've got G, we've got D7. You can even do the Hawaiian one or the barred one. Either is absolutely up to you, and C. Now, we've got the words there, so you can sing along if you want to. If you just want to play along, know that every single one of these chords is held for 4 beats. So you don't have to worry about where you are. All you have to do is count. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. Just keep doing that all the way along. Let's have a go at a couple of verses just to give a feel with how the song goes. And this is one of those songs where the words start before the music, sometimes called a pickup measure. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to count 1, 2, trouble in, and I want you to start strumming on mind, okay? You'll soon get the hang of it. 1, 2, trouble in mind, I'm blue, but I won't be blue always, 'cause the sun's gonna shine in my back door someday. I'm all alone at midnight and my lamp is burning low. Ain't never had so much trouble in my life before. And so on and so forth. So already you can see how formulaic this song is, how simple it is as well. And that's the beauty of the blues. It encourages you to improvise and do something interesting because the chords are fairly standard. In terms of the chords, this song is in the key of G, And almost the entirety of this song is based on that relationship between the 1 and the 5 chords. And I bang on about this all the time, don't I? It just goes to show how important this is in music. So the 1 chord is the G, because we're in the key of G. And the 5 chord, G, A, B, C, is D. And the 1 chord makes you feel at home or rested and resolved. The 5 chord, that D7, makes you want to go back to the 1 chord. It adds tension, which is relieved by going back to the 1 chord. So 8-bar blues is kind of like what it says on the tin. It's 8 bars, and the basic chords are the 1 and 5. We also have the 4 chord in there, the C, G, A, B, C, and we think of that as a change chord. That's just in there to provide a little bit of relief and a little bit of change. So you can think of it as 1, we're at home, 5 provides some tension, 1, we're back home, C for a change, 1, we're home, 5, there's the tension, brings us home. And then this 5 at the end makes us want to go right back to the start. Now, I know I went a little bit nuts there at the end, but it's an important point. If you understand the relationship between chord types, it means you can kind of understand the songs and how music works. But it also helps you out, because if you know that the 5 chord is likely to be followed by the 1 chord, you can start to guess what comes next in pieces of music. That allows you to improvise and play along with people without a music sheet in front of you. Back in its infancy, blues tended to be one of 2 formats, either 8-bar blues, as we have here, or 12-bar blues. And in the long run, 12-bar blues really won out. When we think of classic blues songs, we tend to think of 12-bar blues. Interestingly, most popular music that we have today, and from the kind of 30s, 40s onwards, tends to be in sections of 8 or 16 measures. So if you have a look at this sheet where we have the structure and additions of Trouble in Mind, the first one we have here is just the basic chords, okay? And I've laid them out really simply. So if you want to play along and you don't want to follow the words, you can literally just play 4 beats on each of these. So we're going to play a normal 4/4 common time. And it's really clear to see that we have 2 lots of 4, 8 bars, 8 measures. Remember, bars and measures are basically the same thing. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to start to make little changes to make the music ever so slightly more sophisticated. And this is going to mirror what happened in popular music. These basic blues forms were slightly altered to make them more jazzy. And that's what we're going to do. So let's have a look at the first one, where we're going to start adding dominant chords. So just a reminder, dominant chords are chords that are based off the 5th degree of a scale. So in this case, we're in the key of G. So the dominant chord that we would expect to come up would be D or D7th. G, A, B, C, D. So when we play a D7, it has that dominant quality of making you want to go back to the 1 chord. It has an unresolved quality. Sometimes what songwriters do is they borrow the dominant chord from another key. So if you have a look at the 3rd measure here, rather than playing a G major, I've swapped it out to a G7. That's the dominant chord from the key of C. C, D, E, F, G. And because we borrowed it from another key, it's often called a secondary dominant chord. Now, you don't have to worry about all that theory if you don't want to. A simple way of thinking about it, if you have a chord where you have a letter, such as G, and then a number, 7, that's a dominant chord. If it doesn't have an M for minor or MAJ for major in front of it, it's a dominant chord. So G7 is a dominant chord. It still has that feeling of tension and making you want to go somewhere. And that, ta-da, is exactly what this G7 does. The reason I've changed it from a G to a G7 is that because G7 is the dominant chord in the key of C, it makes you want to go to a C chord. Look what happens in the next measure. We've got a C chord. We call that the 5 of the 1. Instead of just playing a normal major before it, if I play a G7, that is the 5 above C, which is the 1. 5, G, 1, C. So by turning that chord from a major chord into a dominant 7th chord, it creates a feel of movement. So now, G, D7, this G7, see how nicely that leads you into the C. That's its function. The other dominant chord I've put in this variation is a C7 on the fourth measure. And this C7 is the dominant chord from the key of F, F, G, A, B flat, C. But it doesn't go to an F chord, but what it does is it still keeps that sense of movement. By playing the C, followed by the C7, can you see how it kind of takes you on a journey? If I just play through that variation, we feel at home. Tension makes you want to go back home, but we make it a dominant, which takes you to the C. Movement. So that second dominant chord, that C7th chord, is just there to create a feeling of movement. And it's a really common thing to do after a 4 chord, is to turn it into a dominant 7th chord. Again, if that theory doesn't interest you, just have a play along and listen how great it sounds just by making these 2 tiny variations. Let's have a go. So I'm going to play this through without the lyrics because I want you to really hear these chords and the relationship between them. So we're going to play this second one here. I'll put it on the screen. Notice that here we have 2 chords in 1 measure. So all of the rest of the chords are played for 4 beats, but here we have 2 beats and 2 beats. Let's have a little play through, see how we get on. Nice and slow. Join in with me after 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. G, D7, G7, C, C7, G, D7, and G, and D7. So did you feel in that playthrough, we have more of a sense of movement, don't we? G7 makes you want to go to C. And then rather than staying there, C7 provides another sense of movement. That's what I want you to take away from this first part of the song. Dominant 7th chords provide a feel of movement. Let's have a look at another swap that we can make. This time we're actually going to take one of our chords and we're going to change it to another type. Now I've provided this sheet as a bit of a crib sheet of common chords that you can switch around. And I've taken the 3 most common types of chords, major chords, minor chords and dominant chords, and I've given you the most common. There are many more than this, but the most common ones that we can switch out for. Notice in the major chords, rather than just a bog standard major, we could swap it out to a major 7, a major 6 or a 6/9. What we're going to do next is we're going to take the G major chords and we're going to change them to G major 6 chords. It's dead simple and it's really effective. Let's have a look. So what is a major 6 chord? Well, quite simply, it's just a major chord with the 6th note of the scale added. It's that simple. So when we play a G major, we're playing the 1st, 3rd and 5th notes from the key of G. That's G, B and D. And if we have a look, we can see that because we have a G here, open string. We also have another G here because we've got 4 strings and we need to repeat. We have a B down here and we have a D here. So G major is a major triad 1, 3 and 5. All we do to create major 6 is we add the 6th note of the scale. G, A, B, C, D, E. The 6th note in the key of G is E. And the easiest way to do that when we're playing uke is to take away this finger. Now remember we have 2 Gs, one here and one here. If we take away this G, which means we've still got one here, we also now, can you see that, have an open E note. So now we've got G, B, D and E. So C major 6 is a 4-part chord. There's 4 notes in it. Now, how does that feel? This is the important thing. 6th chords have a slightly jazzy or bluesy quality to them. I think of a major chord, just a bog standard 1, 3, 5, as feeling really nice and grounded. A C6, just by adding that kind of 6th note, it creates an element of kind of instability. It doesn't feel quite as stable as a G major. So it kind of, a lot of people describe them as quite floaty sounding chords. but do you notice it definitely gives it a touch of bluesy, jazzy quality? Let's have a look and see how that sounds when we put it into the next variation. So, voila! Our next variation, you can see, I've changed all of the remaining G major chords into G6 chords. We've left this one alone because we've already changed that into a dominant chord. So we've got 3 new chords here, and look at the chord diagram, it's dead simple. We're just playing a G chord, but without that third finger. It also means that we can do something quite neat if you want to. When changing from G6 to D7, if we play the so-called Hawaiian D7, you just need to literally move your 2 fingers up and down. So that creates a really nice economy of movement. See that? Then we do switch to G7. Now, if you prefer the sound of the more traditional D7 barred chord, you can switch out to that one. All you need to do is move your 2nd finger along and bar. So experiment with both and see which sounds nicest to your ears. So let's have a play through this variation and see how it sounds. We're going to start with that G6 chord. Come in with me after 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. You might notice I did a barred D7 on that last D7, whereas most of them I was doing this one. That was just to experiment and add a little bit of variation in. So don't feel you have to stick to one shape. You can swap them out and have fun. Notice now we're kind of delving into jazz a little bit. We still have that classic 8-bar blues feel because we're still using the same type of chords, the 1, 4, 5 chords, but because we've altered them slightly, it's starting to sound maybe a little bit more sophisticated, a little bit more interesting. And this is what happened in the history of jazz and blues. They kind of moulded together. Jazz and blues in some ways are kind of indistinguishable at some points. And musicians took the classic blues format, but they started to add an element of jazz to it. So think of people like Count Basie. People think of him as a jazz musician, but really he mostly played the blues with these little additions that we're doing now. We're going to have a look at our 2nd page of variations now. And the one that we're going to change here is the chord right at the end of each verse. And the moment we're playing a D7, we're actually going to change that to a D augmented chord. Augmented chords, in my book, create a feel of drama and suspense. It's like we're ratcheting up. That D7 is already asking a question, but a D augmented really provides the ultimate cliffhanger. And they're kind of used quite a lot in jazz, but also in popular music to create that suspense in a piece. Just a really simple example, It's My Party. The chorus, the first chord could just be played as an A major, just straight through. It's my party and I'll cry if I want to. But notice when I turn the A into an A augmented, how there's a feeling of suspense when I add it. Just one finger, have a listen. It's my party and I'll cry if I want to. Did you feel that? Just that one note adds a feeling of suspense. That's what we're going to do here. We're going to create a cliffhanger right at the end of each verse. And what's an augmented chord, I hear you shout? An augmented chord is basically any chord where we take the 5th note from the chord and we sharpen it half a step. Think of augmenting as adding something. And interestingly, augmented chords are often shorthanded to a plus sign. So if you say D plus, it means D augmented. So when we take a normal D chord, not D7, just a bog standard D major chord, the 5th note in the key of D is A. We have 2 A's in this chord. We have one up here, and we also have the open A string down here. So quite simply, to augment it, we take that 5th note, the A, and we sharpen it half a step. So let's have a look. This A, to sharpen it half a step, we have to put our finger there. That's kind of awkward, isn't it? So let's rearrange these middle two fingers like this. So the second finger is on the second fret of the E string, third finger on the second fret of the C string. And rather than playing this note here, we're going to play this note here. So now we have an A sharp. Can you hear that sense of drama it's creating? Now we've also got to sharpen this A down here, haven't we? Because otherwise we'd have one sharped and one not. So to do that, rather than playing open A, we put our finger down here. Quite a bit of a kind of cumbersome chord, this one. It's quite awkward with 4 fingers. Some people like to bar this and even kind of do a mini bar on this one. I tend to just use 4 fingers right the way across. Just make sure they're not clashing with each other. And we have a lovely D augmented chord. Now, if you're not into the theory of this, you can close your ears for the next 30 seconds, but just an interesting point of order. Why did I play a D major augmented or a D augmented rather than a D7 augmented? Well, I could play a D7 augmented. A D7 augmented would just be a D7th chord with this note here, the A note sharpened. So I would tend to rearrange my fingers so it would be kind of that shape. The reason I prefer the normal standard D augmented, even though it's a bit more cumbersome, is that the last note we hear is that augmented note. Whereas the last note we hear of D7 augmented is this C note. So it doesn't stand out, we kind of pass over it and it goes too quickly. So to really have the power of that sharpened fifth, we've got 2 of them here. I much prefer this chord. And before we launch into playing this, let me just show you a couple of easier ways to get to this awkward augmented shape. We're coming at it from a G6 chord, right? That's the chord before it. And if I have to switch out all the way like this, that's quite a big change, isn't it? So one recommendation I make is when you play the G6 that comes before it, try using your second and third fingers, and then this one can drop down, we switch out, and move up like this. So rather than this kind of change, which is bigger, from here, there's not quite so much going on. Another option, in fact, is to keep this finger where it is from the G6 and move the second finger up and then add these 2. So can you see, rather than being that way round, they're this way round. It's kind of like a D minor shape with this finger added. So in that case, we would go from here, that one would go up, and that one would go on. Now, this is a totally one of those your mileage may vary things. Everyone finds one of these changes easier than the others. I actually tend to use second and third, then I just switch out to this shape. But you need to find which works for you. And what I want you to do before you do the next part of the video is just pause and just practice changing from that chord, G6, to your D augmented. Just practice it round a few times, maybe 2 beats of each. And the more you do it, the more you'll build up the muscle memory and it will feel natural. So let's give this variation with the D augmented added a play through. We're going to go really slow with this, and I'm going to play it through twice to give you a bit of practice, once without words and once with. We'll just keep going into the one with words. So just be prepared for that change at the end to that D augmented chord and give it your best. Nice and slow. 1, 2, 3, 4. D7, G7, C, C7, G6, D7, G6. Here we go, our augmented. Good. Trouble in mind, I'm blue, but I won't be blue always, 'cause the sun's gonna shine in my back door someday. Good. Notice that suspense, that element of drama created by the D augmented chord at the end. Before we look at the last 2 variations, just one very quick element of reassurance for you. The beauty of these chords, where we're swapping them out, either adding extra chords in measures or swapping one chord for another, is that they're entirely interchangeable. So if you dislike the sound of that augmented, because some people find it too discordant, or you find it too tricky to play at the moment, you can just play the D7 and it will be absolutely fine. The point is, I'm kind of giving you lots of things for your arsenal, so you've got lots of opportunities to experiment and see what you like best. If you don't like that one, just try a D7. Think of these as completely switchable chords. One final thing about this D augmented, which I think is brilliant, is it contains a note that voice leads into the next chord. That just means that the chord contains a note that is 1 fret or half a step away from a note in the next chord. So notice that when I play the D augmented, followed by the G6, this A sharp note here on the A string resolves to this B note in the G chord. We call that voice leading, a note from one chord leading beautifully into the next chord. And that's another reason I love the sound of that D augmented. Now, last two changes we're going to make concern something called the turnaround. That's quite simply a series of chords in the last 1 or 2 measures that have a feeling of making you want to go back to the start of a song. Now, we already have a very rudimentary form of turnaround in that D augmented, or if you prefer to play the D7 chord, because that 5 chord makes you want to go back to the start with that 1 chord. What we can do is we can create even more drama by adding a couple of extra chords in the last 2 measures. We've got 2 different versions of doing that. The first is to create something called a 1-4-1-5 turnaround. That just means we play a form of 1 chord, G6, followed by a form of 4 chords, 1, 2, 3, 4, G, A, B, C, a form of C chord, and we're going to play a C9. I'm going to explain this in just a minute. Then we have another 1 chord, and then we have the 5 chord, and we're going to do our lovely augmented. So we've got 1, 4, 1, 5. And can you see how it creates a sense of movement, and that final chord absolutely ratchets up the suspense, which makes you want to go back to the start. So notice I'm using a C9 rather than a C7 chord. A C9 is another form of dominant chord. It's completely switchable with your dominant chords. And in fact, if you have a look in this sheet where I've got the options of switchable chords, the most common dominant chords we switch along are a 7th for a 9th or a 13th. And a C9 is a C7 with the 9th note of the scale added. This is a C, so it's from a C scale. Now, if you think of a C major scale, we could think of it as 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and then we start again, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. But if we kept counting and thought of it as 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, it's that 9th note we're adding. C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C, D. It's another D. On the ukulele, in this circumstance, I can't add a high D very easy without taking out this note. So I'm actually substituting it for a low D. If all that was a bit too much, don't worry. Just know that the C9 chord is like a C7th, but we've added this D note here. And the reason why I've done that is that it smooths out the changes. Going from a G6 to a G9, notice I'm only changing 1 note. So it smooths it out back to a G6, and then here's the big change with the D augmented. And that's why I'm using that C9 to smooth out the changes. It's a classic thing to do in jazz music. You could quite simply play G6, C7, G6, and then your D augmented. But personally, I prefer the sound of the 9 to smooth it out. Now this is where it gets a bit tricky, isn't it? So let's think about fingerings that can help you with this. If we play the G6 using fingers 2 and 3, to get to the C9, notice I just need to drop this one off and add this one here. Going back to G6, I do the same in reverse. And then this finger is ready to come to the D augmented. In fact, notice, when I go back to this G6, I could even keep this index finger where it is, because this one cancels it out, which gives me something to build on for when I go to that D augmented. So what I want you to do is just try playing that round a few times on your own. Try and get as comfortable with that change as you can. So let's practice that final variation together. We'll play it through twice, once with just the chords and once with some singing over the top so you can hear how it sounds. Just remember that when we come to that turnaround, because there's 2 chords per measure, those last 4 chords are all going to be played for 2 beats each. 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. Okay, let's give it a go. After 4, we'll keep it nice and slow. 1, 2, 3, 4, G6, D7, G7, C to C7, G6, D7. Here's the turnaround. Trouble in mind, I'm blue, but I won't be blue always, 'cause the sun's gonna shine in my back door someday. Fantastic. Brilliant. And you can always play that back and practice it along a few times just to get really comfortable with it. Let's take a look now at our final variation. Now, notice on this final variation, as well as a new turnaround, we have another new chord here. Instead of the C7 on measure 4, we're going to play a C sharp diminished 7th. Now, this is one of the most common things that happens in jazz music. Whenever we get the 4 chord, we follow it with a diminished 7th chord, which is half a step higher. So a C will be followed by a C sharp, because C sharp is half a step higher, diminished 7. C, C sharp, diminished 7. And it just creates a sense of movement. It kind of transitions nicely from the C, there's your transition, leading you into that G6, which is really nice. So it's another kind of switchable one. Rather than C, C7, G6, we can play C, C sharp diminished, and G6. And this happens in loads of songs. Quite often when you're playing blues in the key of C, when I go to the F, it will quite often be followed by an F sharp diminished 7th. So it's a very, very common thing to do. In our case, it's really simple as well, because rather than just putting our finger down for a C7, I change to adding 2 fingers, 0, 1, 0, 1 for the C sharp diminished 7th chord. Notice that I tend to play the C before it for my little finger, allowing me then to drop back nice and easily to those 2. But it will work just as easy with the 3rd if you prefer going back. Either's absolutely fine. It's also the diminished chord which is used in a diminished jazz vamp, which is played in loads of songs. Hear that 2nd chord? There it is. And just so you can hear it in the context of this song, the difference that it makes, I'll just play the first line. Here it comes. Notice it's adding a slight jazzy edge to the piece now. Now that works hand in hand with this final combination of chords, the final turnaround. And this turnaround is one of the most common combinations of chords in jazz music. We've actually mentioned this before in different pieces. It's called the 1-6-2-5 combination or turnaround. Let's take a look. Now, as I say, that 1-6-2-5 progression is one of the most common in all of jazz music. George Gershwin popularised it with his I Got Rhythm. That's 1-6-5 in the key of C. 1-6-2-5. Now, normally when you play a 1-6-2-5 combination, the 1 will be a major chord. We've got a form of major chord here with G. The 6 would tend to be a minor chord. Don't worry about this, but normally the 6th chord in a scale is a minor chord. And it's based off the 6th degree of the scale, G, A, B, C, D, E. So you'd expect perhaps an E minor or an E minor 7. I've changed it to an E dominant 7, partly because it has more of a blues feel to it, but also because the movement from this G6 to an E7 is easy because it's one finger. And finally, because changing between a G6 and an E minor 7, there is no change. Believe it or not, an E minor 7 is the same fingering in open position as a G6. So it felt it needed that change. Just in case you're wondering, if you're not wondering, don't worry. So we have the 1 chord, the 6 chord is our E7. The 2 chord, G-A, is going to be based on an A chord, and we're going to do an A minor 7. Easiest chord in the world, no fingers. And then finally, we're going to keep that 5 chord in. We're going to keep our D augmented because it creates that nice bit of tension. So now we have G, E7, A minor 7, and our D augmented. Again, practice that round a few times, get really, really comfortable with it. The nice thing about it is G to E7 is easy, A minor 7 is easy, and that allows you to get your fingers in place to then play your D augmented. So practice that round a few times, 2 beats on each. And notice, as opposed to the last turnaround that we were doing, it has a much more jazzy feel. Do you see how it's kind of less bluesy and more jazzy? So this turnaround was used in some of the versions by people like Louis Armstrong and Nina Simone, as opposed to the more country pop versions by people like Johnny Cash. So let's practice our final variation then. So just the final variation all the way through, adding the diminished 7th chord and our new jazz turnaround, the 1-6-5 turnaround. As before, we'll play it twice through, once without vocals and once with, to give you some practice. Nice and slow after 4. 1, 2, 3, 4, G6, D7, G7, C diminished, G6, D7, and our turnaround. Trouble in minds, I'm blue, but I won't be blue always, 'cause the sun's gonna shine in my back door someday. Fantastic. Notice how jazzier now that we've got to. And again, this is kind of mirroring the development of blues turning into jazz blues over the years. One quick final point of order before we piece the whole thing together. We have quite a boring up and down swing strum at the moment, don't we? I actually don't mind that. It kind of reminds me of Johnny Cash's version, which is very, very simple in terms of strumming. And I've done this on purpose. We've got so much going on with this hand, with some really awkward chords, that I didn't want you to think about having to worry about syncopation and things like that with the right hand. But if it reassures you to know, remember next week I'll be coming back with a new video where we're going to stay with this song and I'm going to teach you some nice picking patterns to make it more interesting. So if you want to experiment with right hand technique, add in some syncopation, absolutely go for it. But if you're not totally confident with your left hand yet, just keep it to an up-down strum and it will sound really nice because we've got some really splendid things happening this side, haven't we? Now remember, the whole point of me providing you with all these variations and all these switchable chords is that This allows you to experiment yourself. Now, there isn't one true arrangement of this that I want you to follow. All of those artists I mentioned at the start have different versions of this song in different keys, but also with different amounts of extendable chords and turnarounds. So there's no right answer which one of these variations you play at any particular point in the song. You could stick to one variation through the whole song. You could change it with every verse. You can even mix and match them up, which is really, really an exciting thing to do. So what I'd like you to do after you finish watching this video is muck about. Play around with them, see which ones you like, see which ones you don't like, totally fine, and start creating your own combinations of this song. If you're able to, why not post them on my Facebook group? I'll put a link to the new Facebook group I've created for my students, or even on YouTube. I'd love, love, love to know how you're getting on with this, and I love people to share their work. If not, keep it to yourself. Totally cool as well. But I didn't feel it was right if I didn't have some kind of play along at the end where you can kind of play along with me and see how it all fits together and try some of these things. So here's what I'm going to do. On our original sheet, which is this one here, we have 5 verses, if you like, or 5 strains of the same thing. What I'm going to do is I'm going to play the first 2 verses as they're written out with the very basic chords, literally the ones that are written above the words. Then for the 3rd, 4th and 5th verses, I'm going to use in turn the variations on the second sheet. So the first 2 verses, no variation at all, just what's written. Then the 3rd verse, we'll use this one, the 4th verse, this one, and the 5th verse, this one. So we're gradually becoming more and more complex. Again, remember these are switchable chords. Even if you're playing at the same time as me, you can experiment a little bit. Occasionally on the turnarounds, they might clash, but generally you can get away with it. It will sound absolutely fine. So let's give that a go. 2 normal verses and then each of the variations on the second page. Remember that the words start before the music in this song, so I'm going to count 1, 2, treble in, and you're going to start strumming on mind. I'll give you an example. This isn't the start, but just an example. 1, 2, trouble in mind. There we are. I'm blue. Let's give it a go. Trouble in mind, I'm blue, but I won't be blue always, 'cause the sun's gonna shine in my back door someday. I'm all alone at midnight, and my lamp is burning low. Ain't never had so much trouble in my life before. I'm gonna lay my head on some lonesome railroad line and let the 219 train ease my troubled mind. Trouble in mind, I'm blue, but I won't be blue always, 'cause the sun's gonna shine round my back door someday. I'm gonna lay my head on some lonesome railroad line, let the 219 train ease my troubled mind. Well done, everyone. Brilliant. And remember, you can rewind that back as many times as you like and practice along. Now, notice at the moment we've got 5 verses, which is quite a lot of verses if we don't do something to keep it interesting. So by adding these variations and alternating the turnarounds, it means that every verse is slightly different, which is really a great thing to do, I think. What we're going to do next week is add a finger picking pattern so we can add even more dynamics in. We can strum and we can finger pick some of these verses. But more than that, we're also going to have a look at soloing, some very simple blues scales that we can learn to solo over the top of this. And that means then if we're playing with others, we can add another layer of dynamics and another break from the vocals. We can have some instrumental verses, which is an absolutely fantastic thing to do. In the meantime, as I said, make that your own. Practice those techniques of swapping out those chords, change around as much as you want and experiment. That's what I really want. And most importantly, have loads of fun with it.